Hello everyone and welcome back to Three Sisters Homestead and Bakery. I am Kalyn and today I'm going to be showing you how I do my starter and how I maintain my starter. The starter is a very important part of the sourdough process because this is what is going to make your bread rise. So you want it to be really strong, really healthy so you can get a good rise out of your bread. So this is a batch of 12 loaves. This is actually 13 loaves that I have. They're going to be getting shaped in just a minute, and I was able to do this with my starter. Stick around to the end of this video if you would like to see how I do my sourdough starter for big batches. So I'm baking first thing in the morning and I can get my sourdough starter to last through the afternoon. So if you'd like to know how to do that, if you're just starting out with doing big batches, then stick around. So I own a micro bakery here in Simpsonville, South Carolina. So if you're in the local-ish area and you want to get some of my bread, you can go to the New York Butcher Shops in downtown Simpsonville and Augusta Road. I sell some of my things there, as well as we are going to be at the Frosty Farmer Market in Greenville. It's at the McAllister Square, and we will be there most Saturdays, and it's going to be running through from January through the end of April. So definitely check us out on Instagram, Facebook. We always post when we're going to be at different markets. So let's get into making this starter. So the first thing you're going to need, of course, is some starter. So this is what I have left over from my last bake. You can tell it's very soupy. Let me get the lid off. It's very soupy, very like lots of little bubbles, kind of, it looks like soap would be in there. That's how you know that your starter is hungry. So I made a lot extra from my last batch. I made extra on purpose because I'm actually making crackers, and I have a sourdough discard crackers that I like to make, and I need a lot of discard. So I'm going to just be using a little bit of this to feed my starter today, and I'm going to be saving the rest of this for my crackers. So when you are starting out and wanting to make lots of different sourdough items, is you're going to want to write out how many batches of each thing you're going to want to do and how much starter that requires. Add it all up. What I like to do is I like to go online, Google sourdough or starter calculator, and you will see some different sourdough starter calculators. I like the Food Geek one. It's simple. And what you would do is you can choose your ratio. So when you're doing big things like this, where you're gonna need your starter to last for a few hours at peak, you're gonna wanna do a higher ratio. So that means I normally do a 1:5:5 ratio. So that means I'm using 1 part starter to 5 parts flour and water. When you do that, you are giving your starter a lot of flour and water to eat on, so it's gonna last longer. Whereas if you do a 1:1:1, which is equal parts flour, water, and starter, your starter is gonna eat through that flour really fast. So it's gonna peak really fast, and it's also going to like deflate really fast. So you want something that's going to last. So I would suggest a 1:5:5 or higher. The higher you go, the longer it's going to take to get to peak. So I don't recommend going too high. I think 1:5:5 is the perfect amount. So like I said in previous videos, I weigh everything out on the scale. Highly recommend. I'm going to start out with 500 grams of this starter. It's a little bit over. All right. This is going into a big bucket. I always like to measure into separate bowls outside of the bucket you're going to be using for your starter. That way, if you over pour, it's easier to get it out if it's in a separate bowl. So I have my starter in there. That was 500 grams ish. I think I went over a little bit, which is fine. I'm looking at my board and I see that I need about 2,500 grams of flour and water. So I like to reuse these. So our fridge actually went out and it was not working. And so I had to go to the store and buy filtered water because our water filter on our fridge was not working and I had orders to do. So I bought a few bottles of water and I've just saved them, and I actually pour the water from my fridge bucket into these, and it just makes it easier. I'm able to leave them out and they get to room temperature, and it's just a lot easier than me going back and forth to the fridge. So I like to go ahead and mix together my water and my starter. It just makes it easier when you go to add the flour that these two things are already mixed together. I guess to better explain the ratios, so 155, I'm just going to use simple measurements. So let's say I'm going to be using, I want a total of 1,100 grams of fed starter. So I'm going to do 100 grams of starter, so the one that's unfed, and then 500 grams of flour and 500 grams of water. So that's 155. So the 500 grams of flour and water are going to give you the 1,000. So 500 and 500 is 1,000. And the 100 grams of the starter gives you 1,100. That's why that calculator that I mentioned earlier is really nice, is because you can put in there what ratio you want and then the amount of starter you need to make, and it'll tell you exactly how much unfed starter you need and how much flour and water you need. So I can sit here forever and try to mix this with a spatula, and that is how I have been doing it for the past year or so. But I'm going to tell you, it is so much easier when you are mixing a large batch of starter like this to just go in with your hands. Yes, it's messy, but it's so much faster, and I feel like you're able to feel the clumps because once there are clumps, it's impossible to get them out. If you don't get your clumps out in this stage, you're just gonna have clumps later on. So yeah, I'm feeling all this dry flour here at the bottom. It's so much easier to do it with your hands. So something that you might not know about me from looking at me is that I am actually Cuban. So my grandmother was born and raised in Cuba, and she met an American, a Navy man who was stationed in Cuba, and they met and they got married, and she moved to America. So that is my grandmother, and when she moved to America, they lived in Key West. There's a naval base there, so they lived there, and one of her brothers, well, actually, so first she became friends with a lot of people on the island, and actually a lot of people in Key West at that time were Cuban, and because it was so close to Cuba. And so my grandmother met this man who had, I don't think he had like an actual bakery at the time. I think he was kind of doing like this, like out of his house, kind of a thing. And when my grandmother's brother ended up moving to Key West from Cuba, he did not speak English and he needed a job. And so my grandmother asked if her friend would, teach her brother how to bake, because he did Cuban bread, her friend did. So her friend did Cuban bread, and so he said, yeah, that he could come and start learning from him and work with him. So they did that for a while, and then they ended up opening up the bakery, and they used to provide Cuban bread to all of Key West. And when I was growing up, I remember very fondly, that was like my favorite thing, was going to the bakery, and my grandmother would take me and we'd go through the side door, because that's where Jesus, that was my grandmother's friend, he did wedding cakes. And so that the side door was like his like cake section, and we would go in that door and he would give me he would get like that parchment paper, and he would roll it up like you would to be decorating a cake, and he would just load it up with meringue, and I would just squeeze it into my mouth. It was the best. But the bread was really good, and I remember that was another one of my favorite things, is we would get some bread and they would lather it up with butter, so much butter, and then you press it and it like smushes the bread and it becomes really toasty, and the butter just like melts into the bread. So good. And you dip that bread into your coffee. It's the best breakfast. This is almost done. I'm just feeling a few more clumps. Want to make sure I get all the clumps out. Now, they didn't do sourdough at that bakery. It was just like a traditional yeasted bread, but I still have contact with, so the bakery closed actually not that long ago. It closed down, but I am still in contact with my family who was part of the bakery. So my grandmother's brother had 3 sons, and I'm still friends with them like on Facebook. So I was thinking of asking them if they by any chance still had the recipe, and so I could try to convert it into a sourdough recipe. I think that would be really fun. Now, the cool thing about sourdough And starters is that starters can last as long as you feed it and maintain it and, you know, keep it happy. Starters can last hundreds of years. That's where you get that San Francisco sourdough that everybody talks about. There's so many places that have sourdough from like the 1800s. Don't be fooled, guys. Just because it's from like 200 years ago, I'm sorry, but all of that starter from 200 years ago, you don't have any of that in your current starter. It has changed and it has evolved. Actually, once you bring it into your house, it's going to completely change anyways, because our bacteria and our wild yeast that we have in our homes is going to be different, even just based on the house down the street. It's just everyone's environment is so different. Okay, I think this is done. I think I've got out just about, you could just spend forever just like squishing this around. It's kind of fun. But once you feel like you got all the clumps, then that's it. I would suggest marking the side of your container. So mine is it's about the 5. So I want it to rise all the way to the 10. I imagine that when I get up in the morning, it will probably be more around like right here. So like the 13 liter mark is what I'm guessing, which is totally fine. You just want it to double in size. So some people, if you're doing this on a smaller scale, like just in a mason jar, people will just use like a hair tie or a rubber band to mark where you started at. In bigger bins like this, I like to, well, for me, I just remember, but sometimes I will just get like not a Sharpie, but like a dry erase marker, and I will just write on the side of this bin because it will just wipe off whenever I'm, done. Or I'll get painter's tape and I'll just like mark it with painter's tape. And then you can write on it like how much starter you used, how much flour you used, when you did it. If you kind of want to really like keep track of all that, then you could do the painter's tape route. I'm just trying to get all of this off. I only used one hand, that way only one hand got really dirty, but and then you do want to scrape down your sides, because sometimes, especially when you're just beginning, when it's not scraped down on the sides, sometimes you're like, oh my goodness, did it rise to that line and then fall? Because it can look like that. So it's just, I like to scrape down my sides, and then plus you don't get dry, crusty bits on the sides of your container. But there you go. That is how you feed a starter for doing large batch sourdough baking. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any other questions about sourdough, either on a small scale or on a larger scale like this, then definitely leave them in the comments below, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye!